in a way, you could imagine a continued kind of chest-thumping, expansionist political nationalism coming out of the White House is likely to lead to a weakening of that cultural nationalist populism. And I think if this continues, voters are going to start thinking more in terms of the threat from the U.S. Politically rather than the internal cultural threats.
From roller coaster tariffs to Greenland and Canada to the Panama Canal, Donald Trump is aggressively pursuing his idea of an America First agenda. Here's Trump on Greenland from the Oval Office on Thursday.
What is your vision for the potential annexation of Greenland and getting the potential?
Yeah, well, I think it'll happen, and I'm just thinking, I didn't give it much thought before, but I'm sitting with a man that could be very instrumental. You know, Mark, we need that for international security, not just security, international. We have a lot of our favorite players, cruising around the coast, and we have to be careful. And we'll be talking to you. It's a very appropriate, really a very appropriate question.
And there's an issue in the high north, so the Arctic. So what you did, so when it comes to Greenland, yes or not joining the US, I would leave that outside for me, this discussion, because I don't want to drag NATO in that. But when it comes to the high north and the Arctic, you are totally right. The Chinese are now using these routes. We know that the Russians are rearming. We know we have a lack of icebreakers. So the fact that the outside Russia, there are 7 Arctic countries working together on this under US leadership is very important to make sure that that region, that part of the world stays safe. And we know things are changing there, and we have to be there.
Here's how Canada's Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, who's hoping, of course, to become prime minister, responded to Trump's, quote, 51st state threats recently.
The gentleman asked in French about President Trump's comments on me. The president says that he doesn't like me. He doesn't think that I'm a MAGA guy. I am not. It is true that I am Canada first. I am only for Canada. I'm fighting for the interests of this people and this country. And if that upsets foreign leaders, including the American president, I'm fine with that, because I have one job to do, and it's to fight for this country. And let me be also clear. We will never be the 51st state. We will be self-reliant, sovereign, and stand on our own feet. We will be an independent and a sovereign country, and I will always stand up for our flag and our people.
Thank you. Now, this is a really interesting dynamic because some American populists viewed Poilievre as an important upcoming ally. Trump's tough words for Ukraine in recent weeks also split populists in Europe to some extent. Author and professor Eric Kaufman made these observations in an excellent Telegraph article recently, arguing Trump is, quote, weakening populism worldwide. Kaufman believes Trump's imperial priorities and bluster detract from time spent on more popular cultural issues and needlessly split the global movement to battle center-left elites. Quote, outside the US, the America alone approach drives up the visibility of political nationalism, wrote Kaufman, adding, countries are forced to defend against American aggression and ignore the internal cultural threats facing them. This will create a weaker and more divided international right. I've said this before, but it's my position that a lot of Trump's imperial talk and bluster is designed just to get better deals in places like Panama, where his administration merely ended up facilitating, it looks like right now, a sale to BlackRock, and seems to be satisfied with that. But of course, even words have consequences, so I want to hear more about Kaufman's theory, and I'm pleased to say that he joins us now. Eric Kaufman, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, I've wanted to have you on for a really long time, and you had a very interesting piece in the Telegraph recently, just sort of analyzing how Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy from the perspective of a populist has actually weakened populism worldwide. This is a post you said Trump's power trip is weakening national populism worldwide. And then you asked why. So could you tell us just a little bit about, especially in the context of the last couple of weeks, where you see this coming from?
Yeah, and of course I should say, as a Canadian living in Britain, I have a different view on this, say, than say an American viewer. But essentially, what populism, or at least right-wing or national populism, is primarily about is the issue of immigration, and then secondarily also about issues around what we might call the culture war, which is really around speech boundaries and the treatment of national traditions in the culture. So these two issues, I think, are really central for understanding national populism. So if you, like me, you're a data person, a political scientist, if you look at people's attitudes on to immigration, how important an issue it is for them, and their attitudes on culture war questions, how important that is for them, you will get a pretty good model of who is going to vote for populist right parties. So that's the first thing to say. Now, the second point I make in the article is that there's really two types of nationalism. Nationalism really is really attachment to a community based on territory and history and culture to some degree. But there's really two expressions of that. One is political, and that could mean separating. Think of if you imagine Quebec separating from Canada or Scotland separating from Britain. That's a sort of political nationalism which says we don't like the way the power structures are designed around our culture block. We're inside this country called Canada and we want to be outside and have our own. That's a political kind of nationalism. But so too is a kind of nationalism like China's that would say we need our pride back after humiliation, and so we want Taiwan, or we want to exert our power in world affairs. That's also a kind of political nationalism. The cultural form of nationalism is about primarily defending or reviving what is perceived to be an erosion of your culture. And immigration restriction is part of that. Sometimes programs of linguistic revival, like Ireland trying to revive Gaelic as the national language or prevent it from declining in Wales. These are also forms of cultural nationalism. Now, what I'd say there is that, again, immigration is central to current populism. That defensive cultural nationalism is really the way to understand populism today in Europe, but also to a large measure in the US as well. What we see with Trump is some elements of that cultural nationalism, which were very popular around the world with populists. So, for example, going after DEI, controlling the border. These are all things that, or talking about American history. Those are all things that resonate really well and were encouraging to, let's say, national populists and even center-right intellectuals around the West. This shift and Doge's the way it's, even though it's not going about it necessarily in the most sort of rational way, the attacks on, the funding of scholar activism by the National Science Foundation, by the Department of Education, USAID, all of those things, again, were cheered. When Vance gave a speech at Munich, again, talking about immigration and free speech, those things were cheered. However, that's cultural nationalism. If we then shift to saying, okay, Canada's the 51st state, they're going to become the 51st state, menacing Canada, or saying we want Greenland, or, rename the Gulf of Mexico, or, some of these more expansionist, imperialistic sounding things, that's more political nationalism. And that actually encourages a defensive reaction. Same with tariffs. Tariffs, again, it encourages a defensive reaction in the rest of the world. So in Canada, good example is the Conservatives, who are sort of the most populist version of conservatism, which is still a very mild version of populism under Pierre Poilievre. They've been ahead in the polls by 20 points. People were sick of Justin Trudeau and his woke cultural extremism, his, mass immigration policies. They were sick of all that. They wanted a sort of renewed Canadian pride. And so justly we're punishing the Liberal Party. But then what happens is you get Trump talking about this 51st state stuff and putting on tariffs. And all of a sudden, there's a rally around the flag effect. And who benefits from a rally around the flag effect is the existing leader. We saw that in COVID too. When there's a threat, the country pulls together, and the beneficiary of that, at least initially, is the incumbent party. And so what you've had here then is a weakening of populism in Canada. Likewise, one can make the argument that Elon Musk's interventions in Germany likely didn't help the AfD, which arguably underperformed. I know it's doubled its vote, but it's, compared to other populist parties in Europe, not doing spectacularly well. Britain, Keir Starmer, the unpopular, his popularity ratings are very low. Labour Prime Minister seems to have gotten a shot in the arm for being this kind of, stout defender, going to go over to talk to Trump and being this international statesman. So it's just a way of saying that, in a way, you could imagine a continued kind of chest-thumping, expansionist political nationalism coming out of the White House is likely to lead to a weakening of that cultural nationalist populism. And I think if this continues, voters are going to start thinking more in terms of the threat from the US politically rather than the internal cultural threats.
Right. No, it's interesting because it's the tension between American imperialism and nationalism in countries that have sympathetic audiences to Trump's national populism, which I wanted to ask you about because you're, like you said, a data guy, and a lot of people will mark the beginning of this era of resurgent right populism in the West as Brexit. And then Trump comes along shortly thereafter and is also seen as sort of the man who takes up this mantle and is a shot in the arm to the populist cause. So it's interesting then that he would be the person who, in the long run, undermines the actual cause of populism.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, where does you're right. So there's the important international dimension to the rise of populism. I mean, as you say, Nigel Farage and Brexit was an inspiration to Trump. I mean, I think it's worth saying that the beginnings of the populist moment really are in that 2014 European Union election, where UKIP, the Front National, and the Danish People's Party all get nearly 30% of the vote. That was the first big shock. And that's really coming in the wake of rising immigration numbers, which peaked in 2015 with the European migrant crisis, where the AfD suddenly shoots to prominence as Merkel lets in over 1 million asylum seekers. So that's kind of the beginning. But I think in the US too, part of this is immigration, that the Central American mothers coming to the border in large numbers in 2015, and that kind of really gives Trump an advantage in the primaries. So immigration is kind of central to this story, but likewise, there is a similarity on both sides of the Atlantic in thinking, and the rise of this populism is inspiring. There's kind of a demonstration effect, both sides. So you're right. So there was in a way, and has been, you listen to Steve Bannon, he talks about this kind of international populist movement. And of course, CPAC or NatCon, you have a very international set of speakers. You got Milei from Argentina. You've got Nigel Farage there. And so there is this sense that we're part of this rising international tide. That's been important for legitimating Trump as well. And Trump's been important also for legitimating to some degree, or at least inspiring, the Bolsonaros and Mileis and others, and also those in Europe. So there's been this kind of what I'd call the populist international almost phenomenon. And now what you have, of course, is a much more expansionist political nationalism from Trump, which is now starting to get blowback. You see it in a number of different ways. Farage, who is a friend of Trump's, whenever he's tried to get a bit political and economic in his nationalism, talking about, negatively about Ukraine, or that NATO provoked Russia, that goes down really badly with his base. And so part of this is also this kind of mercantilist, isolationist attitude to Ukraine, and almost taking the side of dictators. That's another aspect, I think, of this political nationalism. And it's, again, goes down generally very badly for many populist right voters. So yeah, I would say that because of this international populist movement that's been important for legitimating Trump and MAGA, and you saw that at CPAC, and you see it in many ways, to now sort of turn on that, or to do things that are going to weaken that, which is the way I see what Trump's doing, is actually fragmenting that coalition internationally. Le Pen, likewise, and some other European politicians, if they try to sound like they're cozying up to Putin, that is really damaging for them. And so, again, there are all these constraints, but that narrative around the political international relations side of this populism from Trump, saying Ukraine's ripping us off and Putin's not a bad guy. I mean, that's sort of, again, weakening and fragmenting, I would say, this international populism.
Is there any risk, and maybe Polyev is a good example of this, that Trump's sort of, let's say, what's the right word for this, his imperial ambitions, his ostensible imperial ambitions, even though they're part of potentially negotiating, that's right, to be determined. I don't think Canada's going to become the 51st state, and I don't think he thinks that either. But is there a risk, actually, that he turns this sort of international populist movement actually against the United States, that other people start sort of rallying in their anti-American sentiments of, like, this is a chauvinist bully. The United States is becoming what we all thought we were rallying against. And it's an interesting tension for Trump with Zelensky, even because on the one hand, Trump and Vance kind of agree that the United States put Ukraine in the position that it's in right now, which it's a strange situation for them to be arguing on behalf of the U.S. here. But all that is to say, is there a genuine risk that some of these other right populist movements actually unite against the U.S.?
I think they will certainly go into coalition with those who are arguing against American tariffs or policy on Ukraine. I mean, you see that in Canada, where there isn't a paperclip between Poilievre's Conservatives and Trudeau, now Mark Carney's Liberals, on their posture on the tariffs and the 51st state stuff. So it is uniting. I think Poilievre believes it, but it's also a matter of political survival. Like, if you were to be seen to be soft on Trump in Canada, then you're going to be really damaged. That's just one illustration, but I think it gets to this. So yeah, I think it is damaging. Now, the effects in Europe are not felt as imminently. The tariff threat is it's trade with the U.S. is not as large a share of GDP. The economies are not as integrated as the Canadian one is. So it won't be seen as threatening. Trump's not saying he's going to annex, except for Greenland. He's not saying he's going to annex European countries. So it's going to have a milder effect. But I think the attitude on Ukraine is the one that's probably the most damaging there. Is that going to affect the individual populist right parties? If they are associated with that particular view, then yes, probably. But maybe not in general. But I think this kind of gets to a bigger, like a wider point around, there is a version of nationalism, which is a sort of principled version, which says, nations should be able to determine their own affairs, should develop and protect their cultural particularity. If you take that approach, you would say, Russia has no business invading a sovereign country that has self-determination rights, or the U.S. has no business laying claim to, a country. Greenland, you might say, okay, they should have the right to self-determination from Denmark, but they've already had these votes. The idea of laying claim to Canada, for example, is clearly an infringement of a principled nationalist position, which says, nations rather than empires should be the form of government. People should rule, not dynasts and monarchs and elite rulers. And so, in a way, what Trump's doing is he's moving away from that kind of a principled nationalist position. Now, I should say that controlling your borders, being able to teach your history in a proud way without it being attacked in the elite institutions by DEI, those are all things which are in accord with a kind of principled nationalism, a philosophy of nationalism. However, laying claim to other countries, for example, or being aggressive in terms of tariffs and things is probably not. The tariff one we could argue, but it certainly violates that spirit, and certainly not defending a country that's been invaded violates that spirit. So I think the more you get a kind of America alone, what would I call it, imperialistic nationalism. That sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't, because if all you are about is might makes right, whoever has the power, we're going to use it, rather than we're adhering to a set of principles. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. And I think this is also a bigger danger for the wider Trump and Musk project, is if you abandon any kind of moral language and it's just about we have the power, we're going to do this, I think you lose a lot of support in other countries. And I think that's a danger, I think, for the Trump project.
Yeah, and lastly, this connection between the cultural national populism and the economic national populism is pretty interesting as well. I mean, it's a really rich space for discussion, but just on this front about how it may be weakening, Trump has virtually closed the border back just in the last month. I mean, Biden could have done that. He actually got kind of close to doing it towards the end of his presidency. But it's almost like the issue's being taken off the table. And yet at the same time, there's this question of mass deportations, and Europe has dealt with, you can stem the tide and not have a lot of more people coming into the country, but still have people who came into the country there, and you have to have the conversation politically about what how to handle that influx when people are already there, as opposed to stopping people from continuing to come. And that's really where we see the cultural nationalism and the economic nationalism so closely tied together, that it's not just about a nation having borders and having some sense of pride in that, but also this hurts workers is the argument that Trump and others will make. So what does, I guess, Trump's approach to tariffs and potentially like Greenland, how does that then trickle into the way other leaders see the marriage of like this is an ideological opposition among populists to elites making decisions top down that are not only economically bad for people, but also are culturally bad for people. And they're sort of the argument is they do that intentionally. It's kind of interesting then when there's, I guess, a tension there. So what could happen to that the marriage that people see between the economic and cultural nationalism?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because obviously economic nationalism traditionally has appealed more to the left, this idea of being against globalization and offshoring and that kind of thing. I think the issue here is it's a complicated, almost it gets more technical because if you increase tariffs, you may increase the price of goods, you may cause inflation, and that's going to hit working people as well.
Right.
The other thing is you may actually drive up a need for labor and therefore a need for immigration. If you are not, so if you want to grow all your grapes and strawberries in the US using American labor, I mean, just to take one example, rather than allowing Mexico to grow those things with their lower cost labor, there will be pressure, pressure to import people to do that work. And so there's a whole bunch of tensions. You may face higher immigration and higher prices, but you may actually onshore some jobs. But what kind of jobs? I mean, if you're talking about Canadian lumber and steel, and these are lower down the value chain. And if you're paying more for your steel, are your cars going to be competitive in international markets? It might make it harder to export. And these are quite tricky economic questions that I don't think are easily answered by, sentiment, that one way or the other. I mean, I think on balance, I think they are probably going to be negative. The other thing is they suck a lot of attention. If you are really involved in foreign policy spats, economic trade wars, that is going to be the focus of newspaper articles. It'll be the focus of floor time in Congress. It's going to take political capital away from what might be a cultural agenda. So, for example, if we talk about trying to get DEI and woke out of the universities, trying to get a more balanced history curriculum taught in schools, that is I would argue, a much more important thing in a way than a very dubious set of tariffs, which could hit you many different directions. It's very hard to predict what that's going to do. And you're likely to lose popularity as prices go up with voters. And so it's an extremely risky thing from a political capital perspective. But this battle against woke ideology, which is, I believe, extremely important for a whole bunch of reasons to do with both the way it affects free speech, but also the way it affects social cohesion and national identity when you have attacks on majority groups, attacks on culture that's associated with whites and men, the national identity in schools, built on stolen land, or it's all about slavery. The need to rebalance all that is not going to be fixed with a few executive orders. It has to be a very patient, long-term process, ideally involving legislation, institution building, far-reaching reforms, making a moral case for why this is extremely important as well. Not just saying we're doing it because we got the power. Again, that sort of might makes right logic, I just think is not going to last. Just like executive orders can be easily rescinded, you need a kind of much more determined, the kind of thing that I think Ron DeSantis would have done, is you make sure that this is not going to be easy to repeal. And if anyone who tries to repeal it is going to pay a huge political price. That's where you want to get to, but that's going to take a lot of energy and focus, because the culture is really the area I think the right has lost consistently on for 60 years. Whereas on the economy, I think, it's a fairly even battle. Foreign policy, similarly. I think the focus should be very much on culture, and anything that takes away from that is actually going to weaken, I think, even the American cultural nationalist project. Now, I grant that workers are probably going to benefit if there's a restricted immigration flow, but most of what we know about immigration attitudes is that these are driven more by psychological and cultural views rather than your own, whether you've lost a job, you're unemployed, your income, etc. So I don't think economics is underlying this, and there's a lot of academic research to back that up. So I think it is primarily a desire not to have cultural security, security for the way of life, and to the extent that's being undermined, I think that should be the top priority.
That is so interesting. Eric, thank you so much for, I mean, this to me felt like a real 30,000-foot view analysis, or like these news cycles are crazy, so you're sort of looking at the trees and not the forest. So thank you for taking the time to walk us through this.
Thanks, Emily. It's been a pleasure.
Well, the, quote, international socialist movement always saw it, over the course of the last century plus, saw itself as being, well, internationalist, right? It's odd for right populists to kind of think of their own movement that way. But actually, that's been the case, that people have seen, for example, Nigel Farage, have seen Poilievre, seen Donald Trump, and maybe even Millet, Bukele, people like that, and lumped them into this one category. We actually see them kind of mingling with one another at different events and finding alliances. Giorgia Meloni, maybe even an example, or Le Pen. These are all examples of people who have found common cause at different times and have sort of been seen as an interconnected movement that strengthened itself by strengthening its ties with one another. And it's interesting to hear Eric's thoughts on how the first, 50 days of Trump's second presidency have changed that. I'm really curious to see where this goes in the future, because again, it's my position that a lot of the bluster is bluster, but obviously you can do some damage in the process. It's a question of whether the means justify the ends, of course, which is maybe the biggest question of the Trump administration in general. So thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe wherever you download your podcasts, subscribe on YouTube, subscribe over at undercurrents.tv. You get an email address to talk to us. You get a weekly email from me. You get premium episodes, and you get all kinds of good stuff from Unheard. So make sure to head over to undercurrents.tv to subscribe, and we'll be back here with more Undercurrents soon.